A millionaire stranded on a rural highway with a flat tire and a young boy steps in to help. But what happens the very next day will leave you speechless. A twist so unexpected it changes both of their lives forever. What secret connects them? Watch to find out, and don't forget to comment your thoughts below. Could kindness really be this powerful? Like and subscribe to join us for more incredible stories. The midday sun bore down on the empty rural highway, its unrelenting heat shimmering off the asphalt. David McAllister tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his black Mercedes, his jaw clenched in frustration. His GPS screen glared back at him, displaying the message he dreaded most. No signal. It was just his luck, running late to a crucial real estate meeting, and now this stretch of nowhere outside Jackson, Mississippi seemed determined to test his patience. As if on cue, a loud thud jolted him forward. The steering wheel resisted, pulling slightly to the left. David swore under his breath, his sleek car coasting to a stop on the roadside. The once quiet isolation of the highway was now filled with the dull hiss of a deflated tire. Stepping out, he was immediately hit by the oppressive heat. Adjusting his perfectly tailored suit, David glanced at his luxury car's rear tire, now flat as a pancake. He muttered curses, loosening his tie with one hand while fishing for his phone with the other. No signal. He let out a long, frustrated breath and looked around. The road was deserted, stretching into a haze on either side. His pulse quickened, not from fear but from the sheer absurdity of the situation. A millionaire who had closed deals worth millions of dollars now stood stranded, utterly powerless against something as mundane as a flat tire. David crouched to inspect the damage, only to realize he had no clue how to fix it. Changing a tire? That wasn't something he ever needed to learn. He had people for that. Assistants, chauffeurs, entire teams of problem solvers. But here, under the scorching Mississippi sun, he was alone. The sound of approaching footsteps startled him. David straightened, instinctively brushing the dust off his suit jacket. A boy, no older than 13, emerged from the shimmering horizon. His appearance was unremarkable yet striking. A worn-out t-shirt that had seen better days, dusty sneakers barely holding together, and an easy, confident smile. "Need some help, mister?" the boy asked, his voice light and unaffected by the heat. David hesitated. His instinct was to decline, wary of strangers, especially someone so young wandering barefoot on an empty highway. But the boy's expression held no malice, just genuine curiosity and perhaps a hint of amusement at the sight of the well-dressed man helpless beside his expensive car. Well, yes," David admitted reluctantly, gesturing toward the flattened tire. "It seems I'm in a bit of a bind." The boy nodded, stepping closer without hesitation. "I can fix that. Got a spare?" David blinked, unsure whether to trust this child with his car. But before he could respond, the boy was already circling to the back, opening the trunk with practiced ease. He located the spare tire and tools in moments, his hands working deftly as if this was second nature. "What's your name?" David finally asked, more out of obligation than curiosity. "Ethan," the boy replied, flashing a quick smile. "Ethan Walker. You?" "David McAllister," he said, watching as Ethan placed the jack under the car. "Nice car, Mr. McAllister," Ethan remarked casually. "Bet it's real fast." David couldn't help a small, grudging smile. "It is, or it was before this." Ethan chuckled softly, his hands steady as he loosened the lug nuts with surprising strength for his age. David found himself staring, equal parts impressed and humbled. This boy, with nothing but a worn t-shirt and bare hands, was solving a problem that had left him utterly useless. Within minutes, Ethan had removed the damaged tire and replaced it with the spare. He tightened the bolts methodically, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. "There," Ethan announced, standing and dusting off his hands. "Good as new." David exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Ethan. I don't know what I would have done without your help." Ethan shrugged. "It's no big deal, mister, just the right thing to do." David reached for his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "Here, take this, for your trouble." Ethan's face shifted, not with excitement but with quiet resolve. He shook his head firmly. "I can't take that." David stared, incredulous. "Why not? You earned it." Ethan smiled again, a little sad this time. "My dad always says you don't help people just to get something back." You do it because it's the right thing to do. For the first time in years, David was at a loss for words. He held the bill in his hand, unsure what to do with it as Ethan started to walk away. "Wait," David called after him. "Where are you headed?" Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "Home," he said simply, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Down the road." David watched as the boy grew smaller in the distance, his bare feet kicking up dust. A strange unease settled over him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. People didn't refuse money, especially not for work they'd done. Climbing back into his car, David adjusted the mirror and caught one last glimpse of Ethan disappearing into the horizon. His frayed shirt and sunburned shoulders lingered in David's mind long after he drove away. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, but David's thoughts remained fixed on that boy, on the quiet dignity in his refusal, the effortless kindness in his actions. It was unsettling, and yet it felt important, like the start of something he didn't yet understand. The penthouse sat high above the bustling streets of Atlanta, a sanctuary of sleek marble floors and towering glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Yet for all its grandeur, the space felt cold, devoid of life. Modern art hung on the walls, sculptures perched on minimalist pedestals, and every piece of furniture spoke of luxury. But as David McAllister sat at his mahogany desk, papers sprawled before him. He couldn't shake the emptiness. The hum of the city below was faint, almost drowned out by the silence that filled the apartment. David leaned back in his ergonomic chair, loosening the tie he had barely bothered to straighten since arriving home the night before. His gaze fell on the crystal decanter of scotch resting on the bar cart nearby. The thought of pouring himself a drink crossed his mind, but it didn't appeal to him. Not tonight. He rubbed his temples, sighing as he tried to focus on the business proposal spread across his desk. The numbers were there, the logistics flawless, yet his mind refused to engage. Every time he tried to concentrate, an image of a boy in a frayed t-shirt and dusty sneakers crept into his thoughts. Ethan Walker. David had tried to dismiss the encounter as a minor inconvenience turned anecdote, but the boy's kindness lingered. Ethan hadn't wanted money, hadn't expected anything at all. That refusal had been like a sharp edge cutting into the veneer of David's meticulously crafted life. He couldn't recall the last time someone had done something for him without an ulterior motive. His eyes drifted to the skyline, where the city lights blurred into the horizon. The reflection of his penthouse shimmered faintly in the glass, a reminder of the wealth and success he'd spent decades amassing. Yet, for all his achievements, he felt strangely hollow. David's thoughts shifted to Marianne, his estranged daughter. A pang of guilt tightened his chest. He could almost see her, a young girl with wide eyes clutching a book as she sat cross-legged on the living room floor. Back then, before the penthouse and the seven-figure deals, they had lived in a modest house. Marianne would wait up for him, hoping for a few stolen minutes of his time after another long day of meetings and phone calls. He had always been too busy. The memory darkened, replaced by Marianne as a teenager, her expressions colder, her tone clipped. She had tried to reach him, had even written him letters, hoping to connect in a way she couldn't face to face. But David, ever focused on his rising empire, had skimmed them and filed them away, too preoccupied to respond. The last time they'd spoken was nearly 5 years ago, and the bitterness in her voice still haunted him. "You only ever cared about what you could build, Dad. Never about the people around you." The words had stung, but he had buried the pain beneath layers of denial and distractions. He pushed back from the desk, restless. Walking to the floor-to-ceiling window, he stared out at the city below, bathed in a wash of amber streetlights and neon signs. The world moved on without him, busy and chaotic. Yet here he stood, frozen, grappling with questions he hadn't allowed himself to ask before. Why couldn't he stop thinking about Ethan? What was it about that boy's kindness that felt like a mirror, showing him a version of himself he didn't recognize, or didn't want to? David turned from the window, his gaze landing on a photograph sitting on a nearby shelf. It was one of the few personal items he had kept, a picture of himself and Marianne at a park when she was 7. Her hair was tied in pigtails, and she clung to his arm, her face lit with pure joy. That smile had vanished long ago. He spent the rest of the evening pacing the penthouse, trying to distract himself with emails and financial forecasts. Nothing worked. The more he tried to bury his thoughts, the more Ethan's face resurfaced. The boy had changed his tire and walked away as if it were the simplest thing in the world. And yet it had left David shaken, questioning everything he thought he knew about generosity, wealth, and the value of a life well lived. The hours stretched into night. David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind a storm of memories and what-ifs. The air conditioning hummed softly, a stark contrast to the deafening silence of his own thoughts. As dawn broke, pale light filtered through the massive windows, casting a muted glow over the penthouse. David sat up, his decision made before he had fully processed it. Throwing off the covers, he moved with purpose, packing an overnight bag. His hands worked methodically, but his mind raced. He told himself he was doing this to repay Ethan, to fulfill some unspoken debt. Yet deep down, he knew there was more. This wasn't just about the boy. It was about something Ethan had awakened in him. A longing, a crack in the armor he had spent decades fortifying. David grabbed his keys and headed for the elevator, the bag slung over his shoulder. As he descended to the parking garage, he felt the weight of his decision settle on him. He didn't know what he hoped to find back in Mississippi. But the pull was undeniable, a quiet but insistent voice urging him to go. Sliding into the driver's seat of his car, David gripped the steering wheel tightly. The garage was dimly lit, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. Outside, the city was beginning to wake, its pulse growing louder with each passing moment. Taking a deep breath, David started the engine. He eased the car out of the garage and onto the street, the rising sun painting the skyline in hues of pink and gold. As the city faded in his rearview mirror, David felt a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation. For the first time in years, he was driving towards something he couldn't quantify, couldn't control, and he had no idea what he would find. The rural Mississippi road stretched out before David McAllister, quiet and unassuming under the soft glow of the morning sun. The same road that had seemed oppressive and lonely the day before now carried a different energy, a sense of potential, a chance to write something he couldn't quite define. The air smelled of fresh earth and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the urban sterility he had left behind in Atlanta. David parked his car on the gravel shoulder, just shy of the pothole that had upended his day. He stepped out, the sound of his polished loafers crunching against the stones breaking the stillness. Tall grass swayed gently in the breeze, whispering secrets he couldn't hear but desperately wanted to understand. His gaze wandered up and down the empty road. It seemed unlikely he would find Ethan here again, yet the pull to return had been undeniable. David wasn't sure if it was gratitude or something deeper, something that had gnawed at him all night and dragged him out of his penthouse before dawn. For a moment he felt absurd, a man of his stature walking along a deserted road in search of a barefoot boy. He adjusted his blazer out of habit, feeling even more out of place in his tailored clothes amid the rustic scenery. But then the memory of Ethan's unguarded smile grounded him. The boy's kindness had been so simple, so free of expectation, that it had stirred something in David he hadn't felt in years. The distant rumble of an engine broke his reverie. A pickup truck rolled toward him, its tires crunching over the gravel. David stepped to the side of the road as the truck slowed, its windows rolled down. "Morning there," the driver called out, tipping his hat. He was an older man, his face weathered and kind. "You lost, stranger?" David hesitated, unsure how to phrase his peculiar mission. "Not exactly," he replied. "I'm looking for someone, a boy named Ethan. He helped me yesterday when I had a flat tire." The man squinted, considering. "Ethan Walker, I reckon. Can't be too many boys like him out this way. You'll find him up at the Walker place. Take that dirt path over there by the oak tree." He gestured with his hand. "House is tucked back near the woods. Can't miss it." David nodded, gratitude softening his usually curt demeanor. "Thank you, sir." The man tipped his hat again. "Good boy, that Ethan. You're lucky he came along. Take care now." With that, the truck rumbled back onto the road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. David turned toward the path the man had pointed out, his resolve solidifying. He climbed back into his car and followed the dirt road, his heart thudding with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The Walker home came into view after a short drive, a modest, weather-worn house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. A makeshift swing hung from a sturdy oak tree in the yard, its frayed rope swaying gently in the breeze. The scene was so far removed from his own polished life that it struck him with a pang of humility. David parked his car and stepped out, smoothing his blazer more out of nervous habit than necessity. He approached the front door, noting the signs of a life lived without luxury yet filled with quiet perseverance. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated. How did one even begin a conversation like this? Before he could overthink it, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her mid-40s. She was slender with tired eyes but a warm, genuine presence. Her hands were dusted with flour as though she had been baking. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious but not unfriendly. David cleared his throat. "My name is David McAllister. I believe your son Ethan helped me yesterday when my car broke down. I wanted to thank him properly." The woman's eyes widened slightly and a flicker of surprise crossed her face. "You're the man with the Mercedes?" David nodded, feeling both out of place and oddly grounded by her frankness. She studied him for a moment before stepping back. "Come on in. I'm Grace Walker. Ethan's out back, but he'll be in soon. Coffee?" David hesitated but then nodded. "Thank you. That would be nice." The interior of the Walker home was small but inviting. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread, and sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the worn but well-cared-for furniture. David took a seat at the kitchen table, its surface covered in faint scratches that told stories of family meals and long conversations. Grace poured him a cup of coffee, setting it before him with a cautious smile. "I'm surprised you came all this way just to say thank you." Before David could respond, the back door burst open, and Ethan rushed in, his energy filling the room. His face lit up when he saw David. "Hey, mister," he exclaimed, his grin wide and genuine. "Did your car break down again?" David chuckled, shaking his head. "Not this time. I just wanted to see you, to thank you for what you did yesterday." Ethan shrugged, plopping into a chair across from David. "It was just a tire, no big deal." "It was a big deal to me," David said, his voice softer than he intended. "You didn't have to help, but you did, and you wouldn't even take anything for it." Ethan shrugged again, his modesty disarming. "Mom says we should always help if we can. It's just the right thing to do." Grace, who had been quietly watching, smiled at her son, pride evident in her eyes. As they talked, David couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the warmth of this home and the cold opulence of his own. Here, love and purpose seemed to fill every corner, despite the modest surroundings. It was a sharp reminder of what his wealth had never been able to buy. He sipped his coffee, its simple flavor more comforting than anything he'd tasted in years. Looking around, he saw small signs of struggle, a patched curtain, a frayed rug, but also signs of resilience and care. David set his cup down, his gaze shifting between Grace and Ethan. A thought had been forming in the back of his mind since he'd arrived, and now it crystallized. "I think there's more I can do to help," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. The kitchen felt warmer than it should on such a mild day, the sunlight filtering through lace curtains that had seen better days. David McAllister sat at the wooden table, its surface scratched from years of use, holding his coffee cup as if it were an anchor. The aroma of fresh cornbread mingled with the faint scent of pine from the woods outside, grounding him in the simplicity of this moment. For a man whose life had been measured in deals closed and assets acquired, it was an oddly comforting sensation. Across from him, Grace Walker leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her expression a careful balance of politeness and skepticism. Ethan, perched on the edge of his seat, swung his feet under the table, his eyes alight with curiosity. David cleared his throat, feeling uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice even. "What Ethan did for me yesterday, it wasn't just a small favor, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Ethan tilted his head, intrigued. "What's that?" David smiled faintly. "How much a simple act of kindness can mean." He set his cup down. "I want to repay that kindness. Not just with words, but with actions." Grace's eyebrows lifted slightly, her posture tightening. "What kind of actions?" she asked, her tone guarded. David glanced around the kitchen, taking in the patched walls and the worn linoleum floor. "I'd like to help you make some repairs. Start with the roof, maybe the plumbing in the kitchen." He gestured lightly. "Things that might make life here a little easier." Grace's eyes narrowed. "And why us? You could have driven away yesterday and forgotten all about it." David met her gaze, something earnest and raw flickering in his expression. "Because I couldn't forget it. Ethan's kindness, it shook me, made me realize how disconnected I've been, from people, from life. This isn't charity," he added quickly, anticipating her objection. It's something I need to do." Ethan's face lit up. "You mean we could get new windows?" he asked excitedly. "And maybe fix the roof so it doesn't leak on my bed when it rains?" David nodded, his smile widening at the boy's enthusiasm. "Exactly." Grace, however, remained unmoved. She uncrossed her arms and took a step closer. "Mr. McAllister, I don't mean to sound ungrateful, but we've learned to be careful about promises. People mean well, but things don't always follow through." Her voice softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. "What makes this different?" David exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "Because I'm not here to make myself feel better or to ease my guilt. I'm here because your son reminded me of something I'd lost, and I want to honor that by doing something real." For a long moment, Grace studied him. The tension in the room was palpable, but Ethan's hopeful expression tipped the scales. "If we agree," she said cautiously, "we start small. No big promises, no overextending." David nodded firmly. "Deal." Ethan practically leaped from his chair, his excitement spilling out in rapid-fire thoughts about what could be fixed first. Grace watched him, her features softening despite herself. "All right," she said finally, her tone more resigned than excited. "We'll give it a try." David's relief was evident, but before he could respond, the screen door creaked open and a soft gust of wind carried in the scent of sun-warmed grass. He turned to see several neighbors standing just beyond the fence, their curious gazes fixed on the unfamiliar luxury car parked in front of the Walkers' home. "Looks like you've drawn some attention," Grace said wryly, nodding toward the small gathering. Ethan glanced out the door, waving enthusiastically. "That's Mrs. Jenkins and Mr. Hill," he explained. "They live down the road. Everyone kind of keeps an eye on things around here." David stepped onto the porch, feeling the weight of their stares. A woman with sharp features and a floral apron, presumably Mrs. Jenkins, whispered something to the man beside her. David caught the words "too good to be true" and "what's his angle" drifting in the breeze. Ethan appeared at his side, unfazed. "They're just curious," he said brightly. "Not many fancy cars come down this road." David chuckled, though he couldn't ignore the underlying wariness in their gazes. He turned to Grace, who had joined them on the porch, her arms crossed again. "I imagine I'll need to earn their trust, too." Grace gave a small shrug. "This is a close-knit place. Outsiders make folks nervous, especially ones who drive cars like yours." David looked back at the neighbors, who were still watching intently. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose trust is built over time." As he made his way to his car, he felt their eyes follow him, heavy with suspicion. Ethan ran after him, stopping just short of the vehicle. "You'll be back, right?" the boy asked, his voice tinged with hope. David crouched slightly to meet Ethan's gaze. "You have my word." He climbed into the car, the engine purring to life. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Mrs. Jenkins whispering to another neighbor, her lips pursed in disapproval. Her words, though inaudible, carried an undeniable air of doubt. David's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Earning their trust would take more than fixing a roof or replacing a window, but he wasn't about to turn back now. The bell above the hardware store's door jingled as David McAllister stepped inside, momentarily pausing to adjust to the dim lighting. The air was heavy with the scent of wood shavings and motor oil, a far cry from the polished marble and delicate florals of his penthouse. Around him, shelves were crammed with every tool and supply imaginable, their labels faint from years of dust and handling. David scanned the room, feeling a ripple of attention from the locals scattered throughout the aisles. Men in flannel shirts exchanged glances, and a few women paused mid-conversation to take in the sight of the well-dressed stranger in their midst. He tugged at the cuff of his tailored shirt, suddenly self-conscious. "Morning, friend." A booming voice cut through the silence, drawing David's attention to the counter where a tall man in his late 50s leaned on an elbow. His name tag read Tommy, and his wide smile revealed a genuine friendliness that immediately put David somewhat at ease. "You look like you might be new around here." "I am," David replied, walking toward the counter. "David McAllister. I'm working on a project nearby and need some supplies." Tommy's gaze flicked over him, lingering on the polished leather shoes that seemed to absorb the dust from the floor. "Well, Mr. McAllister, you've come to the right place. What kind of project are we talking about?" David hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Repairs on a home," he said finally. "A few things to start with. Roofing materials, maybe some plumbing supplies." Tommy's expression softened with understanding. "Ah, the Walker place, isn't it? Word gets around quick in these parts." David nodded, grateful for Tommy's easy demeanor. "Yes, that's the one. Ethan helped me out and I wanted to return the favor." Before Tommy could respond, the bell jingled again, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Helen Jenkins, with her pinched expression and an aura of skepticism, froze momentarily at the sight of David. Her lips thinned into a sharp line as she marched toward the counter. Well, she said, her tone laced with suspicion. "What brings you back to our little town, Mr. McAllister?" David met her gaze calmly. "I'm picking up supplies for the Walkers." "Is that so?" Helen folded her arms, her voice rising enough to draw the attention of nearby shoppers. "You just decided out of the goodness of your heart to help them? What's in it for you?" The room seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. David resisted the urge to bristle, knowing any defensiveness would only validate her assumptions. "Ethan helped me when I needed it," he said evenly. "This is my way of saying thank you." Helen scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "People like you don't just show up and start fixing roofs without a reason. Are you trying to buy their land, or is this some kind of publicity stunt?" David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Tommy stepped out from behind the counter, his easy grin replaced with a firm set to his jaw. "Now, Helen," he said, his voice steady. "Not everyone's out to take something. Sometimes folks just want to give back." Helen glared at Tommy, her cheeks flushing with anger. "I'm just saying we've seen this kind of thing before. Big city types thinking they can waltz in here and what?" Tommy interrupted, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Let the man do something good. If it turns out he's not sincere, we'll handle it. But for now, maybe we ought to give him the benefit of the doubt." A tense silence hung in the air as the other shoppers watched the exchange. Helen huffed, her eyes narrowing at David before she turned on her heel and stalked toward the door. "We'll see," she muttered, the bell jingling sharply as she left. David exhaled slowly, his grip on the counter easing. "Thank you," he said to Tommy, his voice low. Tommy shrugged, his grin returning. "Don't mention it. Helen's got her reasons, but she's not the voice of everyone here." He patted David's shoulder. "Let's get you those supplies." As Tommy led him through the aisles, several shoppers lingered, watching with hesitant curiosity. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap eventually stepped forward. "You really helping the Walkers?" he asked, his tone cautious. David stopped, meeting the man's gaze directly. "Yes, they helped me, and I want to return the favor." The man nodded slowly. "Roof's been bad for a while. Nice of you to do something about it." A woman nearby chimed in. "Grace could use some help. She's done her best, but it's been tough since her husband passed." The atmosphere began to shift, the initial wariness softening into tentative approval. By the time David had loaded his car with the supplies, a few neighbors had even offered their assistance with the repairs. As David secured the last bundle of shingles, he spotted Ethan standing near the edge of the parking lot, a hopeful smile on his face. David waved, his resolve strengthening under the boy's gaze. This was only the beginning, and he was determined to see it through. The gravel crunched under David McAllister's polished shoes as he stepped out of his car, surveying the modest Walker home. A small crowd of neighbors stood at a distance, their murmurs muffled but their stares unmistakable. The supplies in his trunk felt heavier than they should, but David squared his shoulders, determined not to falter. Ethan burst out of the house like a rocket, his face lighting up at the sight of David. "You came back!" he exclaimed, his enthusiasm infectious. "I made a promise," David replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. He opened the trunk, revealing bundles of shingles, a toolbox, and a roll of tarp. Ethan's eyes widened with awe, his excitement palpable. Grace Walker lingered on the porch, her arms crossed. She watched David with a guarded expression, her skepticism still evident. Despite her reservations, she gave a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of his effort. As David began unloading the supplies, the rumble of a truck pulling up caught his attention. Tommy Carter hopped out, waving cheerfully. "Figured you could use an extra pair of hands," he said, hefting a box of tools from his truck bed. David felt a wave of relief at Tommy's presence. "I'd appreciate it. Looks like I have a lot to learn." Tommy grinned. "Don't worry. We'll have you swinging a hammer like a pro in no time." The two men worked together to set up ladders and clear debris from the yard. Ethan darted between them, his youthful energy driving the momentum. The first project, patching the leaky roof. It seemed straightforward enough, at least until David found himself holding the hammer awkwardly, nails slipping from his grasp. "Here," Ethan said, taking the hammer and demonstrating with a quick, confident strike. "You just gotta hit it firm like this." David chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "I think you're a better teacher than I am a student." Ethan grinned. "You're getting there, just don't give up." The rhythm of the work settled in as the sun climbed higher. David's designer shirt clung to him, stained with sweat and dust, but he hardly noticed. Each nail he hammered felt like a small victory. Each plank he secured a tangible sign of progress. For the first time in years, David felt grounded, connected to something real. From her perch on the porch, Grace watched the scene unfold. She saw Ethan's joy, Tommy's easy camaraderie, and David's surprising determination. When David paused to stretch, she walked inside and returned with a pitcher of lemonade and a tray of glasses. "You've earned a break," she said, her voice softer than before. David accepted the glass with a grateful nod. "Thank you, Grace. This means a lot." Grace studied him for a moment, her defenses beginning to crack. "It's not easy for me to trust people," she admitted. "But you're trying. I can see that." Their exchange was interrupted by the faint crunch of footsteps. Helen Jenkins stood by the fence, her arms crossed and her sharp gaze fixed on David. "Busy day, isn't it?" she called, her tone pointed. David met her gaze, forcing himself to remain calm. "Just trying to help," Helen smirked. "We'll see about that." She lingered for a few moments longer, her skepticism evident, before walking away. David turned back to Grace, unsure of what to say. She shrugged, a hint of amusement in her expression. "That's Helen for you. Don't let her get to you." The rest of the day passed in a blur of labor and shared effort. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, the roof was finally patched, its once gaping holes now sealed. Ethan cheered, his joy echoing across the yard. "We did it!" David stepped back, his chest swelling with a pride he hadn't felt in years. The roof was a small step, but it represented something far greater, the beginnings of trust, of community, of something worth building. As he loaded the remaining tools into his car, David noticed Helen standing near the road, her skeptical gaze unwavering. She approached slowly, her footsteps deliberate. "What's your endgame here, Mr. McAllister?" she asked, her voice low but firm. David hesitated, her question cutting through his thoughts. "I don't have an endgame," he replied honestly. "I just want to help." Helen's expression didn't soften, but she nodded slightly before turning and walking away. David watched her retreating figure, the weight of her words lingering in the air. As he climbed into his car, Ethan waved from the porch, his smile bright against the fading light. David waved back, his resolve stronger than ever. The journey was far from over, but for the first time he felt he was on the right path. The sound of hammers and drills echoed through the Walker home as David McAllister worked alongside Tommy and Ethan. The once quiet walls now reverberated with life, filled with the steady rhythm of teamwork. Sunlight filtered through the repaired sections of the roof, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Though the house still bore the marks of years of wear, the signs of progress were undeniable. Ethan darted around the living room, enthusiastically hauling away scraps of old wallpaper and bits of broken wood. "We'll have this place looking brand new in no time, Mr. McAllister," he exclaimed, his smile contagious. David chuckled, straightening from his crouched position near the kitchen sink. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Ethan. But I like your optimism." Grace Walker stood at the edge of the room, watching quietly as David and Tommy tackled the stubborn kitchen plumbing. She crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line, though her expression had softened over the past few days. The sight of David on his knees, wrench in hand, was a far cry from the polished, distant figure she'd met at her doorstep. Yet part of her still wrestled with doubt. What kind of man walked away from a life of luxury to fix up a stranger's home? The steady clinking of tools was interrupted by Tommy's voice. "Pass me that pipe, David. This one's rusted through." David grabbed the replacement pipe, fumbling slightly as he handed it over. "Remind me why I thought I could handle plumbing," he joked, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Tommy laughed. "You're doing fine. It's all about patience." Ethan, watching from the doorway, piped up, "And maybe not wearing a suit while you do it." The room erupted in laughter, including Grace, who quickly stifled her chuckle. David grinned, realizing how much lighter he felt in these moments. For years, his world had been boardrooms and profit margins, where every interaction was transactional. Here, things were simpler, more honest. When lunchtime rolled around, Grace reluctantly invited David and Tommy to sit at the kitchen table. She placed a plate of sandwiches in front of them, her movements deliberate and cautious. "It's not much," she said, her tone tinged with humility. "It's more than enough," David replied, his voice earnest. As they ate, Ethan peppered David with questions about his life. "Did you always want to be a millionaire? What's the fanciest thing you own?" David hesitated, caught off guard by the boy's curiosity. "I didn't grow up with much," he began, his voice softening. "There was a time when I couldn't even afford a decent pair of shoes. My first job was bussing tables at a diner. I worked hard, saved up, and eventually started buying and selling real estate." Grace raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "So you know what it's like to struggle?" David nodded. "I do. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really matters. Meeting Ethan reminded me of that." Ethan beamed while Grace's expression shifted. For the first time, she saw a man who wasn't just a wealthy stranger, but someone who had walked a difficult path, much like her own family. The moment of connection was interrupted by the sharp creak of the front door. Helen Jenkins stepped inside, her arms laden with a basket of cookies. "Thought I'd bring something over," she said, her tone saccharine. "Thank you, Helen," Grace replied cautiously, sensing the underlying tension. Helen's eyes darted to David, her smile tightening. "You've certainly made yourself at home, Mr. McAllister." David met her gaze evenly. "Just trying to help where I can." Helen's voice took on a sharper edge. "And why exactly are you so interested in helping? What's in it for you?" The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Grace glanced at David, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Ethan looked from Helen to David, his expression a mixture of confusion and defiance. David set his sandwich down, leaning forward slightly. "I understand your concerns, Helen. You don't know me, and you have every right to be protective of this community. But I'm not here for recognition or gain. I'm here because Ethan reminded me that kindness matters, that sometimes you just have to do the right thing." Ethan nodded vigorously. "He's been working hard, Miss Jenkins. You should see the roof. It doesn't leak anymore." Helen's gaze softened for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it with a haughty shrug. "We'll see how long this lasts," she muttered, turning on her heel and walking out. The tension lingered long after Helen's departure. Grace cleared her throat, her voice hesitant. "I appreciate what you said. It's not easy to let people in." David gave her a small smile. "I understand. Trust takes time." The group returned to their work, but the mood was lighter. Grace brought out lemonade later that afternoon, a small but significant gesture that didn't go unnoticed by David. Ethan hummed a cheerful tune as he swept the living room floor, his enthusiasm contagious. As the sun began to set, dark clouds rolled in, signaling an approaching storm. David and Tommy packed up their tools, preparing to call it a day. Just as they were finishing, a sudden downpour began, the rain pelting the roof with relentless force. "Uh-oh," Ethan said, his voice filled with alarm. "Mr. McAllister, it's coming through." Water dripped steadily from an untouched section of the roof, pooling on the kitchen floor. David grabbed a bucket, his heart sinking as he realized how much work still lay ahead. The rain poured down in relentless sheets, battering the Walker home and obscuring the view outside. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the steady drip of water invading their refuge. Ethan was the first to notice it, a thin stream trickling down the living room wall and pooling at the base of the freshly cleaned floor. "Mom!" Ethan's voice was sharp with alarm. "It's coming through again!" David McAllister was already in motion, his quick eyes scanning the room for the source of the leak. His hands found the tools and tarp they had stashed earlier, and without hesitation, he began issuing instructions. "Ethan, grab that bucket. Tommy, see if you can shift the furniture back. Grace, keep everyone clear of the water." The urgency in his voice left no room for doubt. This wasn't just about the home. It was a test of his determination, his willingness to prove he could protect what mattered. Ethan hurried to his side, a bucket in one hand and a determined look on his face. "What do we do, Mr. McAllister?" David gripped the edge of the tarp, his designer shoes now coated in mud from earlier repairs. "We fix this," he said simply, heading toward the door with Ethan at his heels. The rain outside was deafening, the storm showing no signs of relenting. David and Ethan climbed onto the slick roof, the icy downpour cutting through their clothes. The tarp flapped wildly in the wind, threatening to fly out of their grasp. Ethan held tight to one corner as David reached for the other. "Careful, Ethan. Watch your footing," David called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I've got it," Ethan shouted back, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Working together, they secured the tarp over the damaged section of the roof. Each movement was painstaking and deliberate, the conditions making the simplest tasks feel monumental. David's hands shook from the cold, but he refused to stop. As they finally drove the last nail into place, a triumphant shout escaped Ethan. "We did it!" David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, nodding in relief. "Good work, Ethan. Let's get down before this storm gets any worse." Inside, Grace paced anxiously, her eyes darting to the window every few seconds. She couldn't see much beyond the rain-streaked glass, but the knowledge of David and Ethan's precarious position made her heart race. Despite her initial reservations about David, watching him risk his safety for their home stirred something in her. When the door finally swung open, both of them drenched and shivering but smiling triumphantly, Grace rushed forward. "Are you two crazy?" she exclaimed, her voice a mix of scolding and relief. David shrugged, water dripping from his hair. "Just doing what needed to be done." Grace grabbed a towel, tossing it toward him. "You could have gotten yourselves hurt." David caught her gaze, his expression serious. "Better us than the house." Later that night, after the rain had subsided, the group gathered on the porch. The storm had left the air fresh, and the faint scent of wet earth lingered around them. David sat slumped on the steps, exhausted but satisfied. He gazed at the roof, now partially shielded by the tarp, and let out a heavy sigh. "There's still so much to do," he muttered. Grace lowered herself onto the step beside him, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. "We've come this far. We'll get there." Her voice was softer now, no longer edged with the same skepticism. David noticed it, and for the first time he allowed himself to relax. "You really believe that?" "I do," she said simply. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the stars were beginning to peek through the thinning clouds. "You've done more than most would." David's lips quirked in a tired smile. "Not enough yet." For a moment they sat in companionable silence, their shared exhaustion bridging the gap between them. Then, without prompting, David began to speak. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he said quietly. "My daughter, Marianne, she tried to tell me once that money wasn't everything. I didn't listen. She's barely spoken to me since." Grace turned her head, her expression softening. "It's hard to admit when we're wrong." "I didn't just let her down," David continued, his voice thick with regret. "I let myself down, and now I don't even know how to make it right." Grace placed a hand on his arm, a small but significant gesture. "You're trying. That counts for something." Inside, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a notebook spread open before him. Inspired by the progress they'd made, he began sketching out ideas. A garden in the backyard, a fresh coat of paint for the walls, maybe even a proper play area for the neighborhood kids. His small hand moved purposefully across the page, his young mind racing with possibilities. Across the street, Helen Jenkins stood at her window, arms crossed. She'd watched the entire ordeal, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The sight of David braving the storm to protect the Walkers' home gnawed at her earlier judgments. Maybe she'd been wrong about him, but she wasn't ready to admit that. At least not yet. As the rainwater glistened under the moonlight, the quiet aftermath of the storm left everyone with something to consider. For David, the night had reinforced his resolve. For Grace, it had softened her heart. And for Ethan, it had sparked a vision of what their home and their lives could become. Morning light streamed through the freshly repaired windows, casting a warm glow over the Walker family's modest living room. Ethan sat cross-legged on the rug, a bundle of papers spread out before him. His sketches, carefully drawn with pencil and colored markers, reflected a vivid imagination and an eye for detail far beyond his years. "Okay, so here's the idea," Ethan began, his voice brimming with excitement. He held up a page featuring a drawing of their porch transformed into a welcoming space with hanging plants and a sturdy new railing. "If we fix the porch, Mom could have a place to sit in the evenings. Maybe we could add a swing too." Grace watched her son with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "Ethan, you've been busy," she said, her tone soft but filled with wonder. David leaned forward in his chair, his eyes scanning the drawings. There was something infectious about Ethan's enthusiasm. "These are good," he said, genuinely impressed. "Really good. You've thought about everything." "This one's my favorite," Ethan continued, holding up a detailed plan for the kitchen. "We could expand it a little, maybe even add more counter space. Mom's always wanted that." Grace blinked, her hand coming up to cover her mouth as emotion welled inside her. "Ethan, why not?" Ethan shrugged, his grin widening. "Mr. McAllister, you said this house could be great, so let's make it great." David chuckled, but his admiration was evident. "You've got vision, Ethan. That's a gift." Ethan's face lit up at the praise. "Really?" David nodded. "Absolutely. And you've inspired me. Let's see what we can do to make these ideas happen." The living room buzzed with renewed energy as the sketches became the foundation for an expanded project plan. Grace, though visibly moved by Ethan's ideas, hesitated. "David, I don't know," she said, wringing her hands. "You've already done so much. This feels like too much to ask." David shook his head. "You're not asking. This is about what's possible, and what Ethan's drawn here. It's more than just plans for a house. It's hope." Grace looked between David and her son, their combined enthusiasm chipping away at her reservations. "Hope," she murmured almost to herself. Ethan piped up, his voice filled with determination. "We can do this, Mom. Together." David took the sketches with him when he headed into town later that afternoon, stopping first at Tommy Carter's hardware store. Tommy greeted him with a broad smile, but it quickly faded as David explained the new scope of the project. "You're aiming big now," Tommy said, scratching his head. "But big means more hands and more money." "That's why I'm here," David replied. "I need advice and I need the community." Tommy nodded, leaning on the counter. "Well, I can reach out to a few folks, but you know how it is. Some of them are still on the fence about you." David sighed. "I get it. I just hope Ethan's ideas can show them this is about more than me." Word spread quickly as David shared Ethan's sketches with the neighbors. A small group expressed cautious interest, intrigued by the boy's creativity and the visible progress on the house. Even Helen Jenkins couldn't hide her curiosity, though she kept her distance. "We'll see if this all pans out," she muttered to another neighbor. Back at the Walker home, progress was briefly halted by an unexpected setback. While assessing the structure with a contractor, David learned the foundation was significantly weaker than anticipated. The news hit hard, the realization of added costs and time sinking in like a weight. David retreated to the porch as dusk settled over the house. Ethan found him there, sitting with his head in his hands. "Mr. McAllister?" David looked up, his weariness evident. "Hey, Ethan, shouldn't you be inside?" Ethan shook his head, holding a steaming mug of cocoa he'd brought out for David. "You didn't give up when you were on the roof in the rain," he said simply. "Why stop now?" David couldn't help but smile at the boy's optimism. "You've got a way of making things seem simpler than they are." "Maybe they are," Ethan replied with a shrug. "You told me every nail counts, right? So we just keep going, one nail at a time." David accepted the mug, his resolve hardening as he looked at the boy who had set so much in motion. "You're right. We'll figure it out." The following morning, as David packed his briefcase with the sketches to revisit funding options, his phone buzzed. The name on the screen made him pause, an old business associate calling with a potentially lucrative deal. The voice on the other end was smooth and persuasive. "David, this could be the biggest opportunity of your career, but we'll need you here in Chicago for at least a few weeks to seal the deal." David's gaze drifted to Ethan, who was crouched on the lawn, measuring out a section of garden space with a piece of twine. The excitement in the boy's movements was palpable, a reflection of everything they'd built so far. The choice weighed heavily, the path forward suddenly splitting in two directions. The rented cabin sat in shadowy silence, its dimly lit interior reflecting David McAllister's turmoil. Papers were scattered across the wooden table, a testament to the whirlwind of thoughts occupying his mind. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, creating a soft hum that only deepened the quiet tension of the room. David sat hunched over, his phone glowing in his hand, the number on the screen blinking back at him. Ryan Kessler. Ryan's earlier call had been brief but persuasive. The investment opportunity was lucrative, promising returns that could solidify David's legacy in the real estate world. But the deal demanded his immediate presence in Chicago and unrelenting focus. There was no room for the leisurely pace of roof repairs or community engagement. "This is your next big win, David," Ryan had said confidently. "Don't let sentimentality cloud your judgment." Sentimentality. David scoffed at the word, setting the phone down and rubbing his temples. He had spent decades avoiding sentimentality, burying himself in deals and deadlines to sidestep the emotional debris of his personal life, and yet here he was, tangled in a commitment to a modest family he barely knew. It wasn't the logical choice, but it felt like the necessary one. The following morning, David arrived at the Walker's house with a carefully neutral expression. Ethan was outside, balancing precariously on a pile of bricks, holding a stick like a conductor's baton. "Morning, Mr. McAllister," he called, grinning wide as he waved the stick in the air. David couldn't help but smile. "Morning, Ethan. You're up early." "Mom says the early bird gets the worm." Ethan jumped down from his perch, brushing dirt off his pants. "We don't even eat worms, but I think it just means to work hard." "Something like that," David chuckled, heading toward the house. Inside, Grace was wiping down the kitchen counter. She looked up when David stepped through the door. "Everything okay?" she asked cautiously. Her tone was gentle, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "You seem distracted." David hesitated. "Just some business stuff," he said, waving it off. "Nothing to worry about." Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, if you need a break, you know where to find us." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord. The idea of someone noticing his struggles, let alone offering understanding, was unfamiliar and unsettling. He gave her a tight smile, then excused himself to the porch. The phone buzzed again. David picked it up and stared at the screen, Ryan's number flashing insistently. His thumb hovered over the accept button, but instead he set the phone down and let it ring out. A part of him felt relief, but another part felt the weight of indecision pressing harder. "You gonna fix this too?" Ethan's voice startled him. The boy stood at the edge of the porch holding a tangle of wire. His eyes were wide and curious. "What do you mean?" David asked, caught off guard. Ethan held up the wire. "The foundation guy said the house needs fixing from the bottom up, right? You're good at fixing stuff, so are you gonna fix this?" David stared at the boy, the simplicity of his words hitting him like a sledgehammer. Ethan wasn't just asking about the house. He was asking about everything, the foundation of trust, the purpose David had been grappling with since their first meeting. "I think I will," David said, his voice steady. "Yeah, I think I will." Ethan nodded solemnly, as if David's answer had been exactly what he expected, before bounding off toward the shed. David watched him go, a strange sense of clarity settling over him. That evening, David sat in the cabin again, his phone in his hand. The number on the screen was different this time. Marianne, his daughter. The message she'd sent earlier was brief. "Heard you're helping a family. Maybe you've finally changed. Call me if you want to talk." David's thumb hovered over the call button, his pulse quickening. Marianne's words carried a sharp edge, but underneath was a sliver of hope. It was a reminder of how far he'd drifted from the relationships that once mattered most. Helping the Walkers wasn't just about repaying a kindness. It was about repairing something in himself. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Ryan, no doubt eager for an answer. David sighed and swiped to answer the call. "Ryan," he said firmly, "I'm passing on the deal." There was a long pause on the other end. "David, this is a mistake," Ryan said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "You're walking away from millions." "I've spent my life chasing deals," David replied. "It's time I chased something else." Before Ryan could respond, David ended the call. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight in his chest felt lighter, though the path ahead was still uncertain. He picked up his phone again, scrolling back to Marianne's message. His finger hovered over the call button. A deep breath, then another. He pressed it. "Marianne," he said when she answered. "It's me." The early morning sun cast a soft golden hue through the cabin's windows, illuminating the quiet space where David McAllister sat at the dining table. His phone rested in front of him, the screen still displaying Marianne's message. For hours he had stared at it, rereading her words until they were etched into his mind. "Heard you're helping a family. Maybe you finally changed. Call me if you want to talk." David leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. It had been years since he last spoke to his daughter, and the memory of their last conversation stung like a fresh wound. She had accused him of prioritizing his career over their relationship, a painful truth he hadn't been ready to face at the time. Now, the weight of her message was unbearable. It was an invitation, however curt, but it also carried the risk of rejection if he mishandled it. The phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It wasn't Marianne, but a reminder of another commitment, a materials delivery for the Walker house. David sighed, pocketed the phone, and grabbed his keys. The text could wait, couldn't it? Arriving at the Walker home, David found Ethan outside, scribbling on a sketch pad. The boy's focus was unwavering as he drew lines and shapes with a determination that reminded David of himself at that age. "What are you working on?" David asked, stepping closer. "A new backyard," Ethan replied without looking up. "I'm trying to figure out where a garden would go. Mom loves flowers." David smiled faintly. "That's thoughtful. Your mom will love it." Ethan finally looked up, his grin infectious. "You think so? Sometimes I mess up though, like this part here." He pointed to a smudged line. "But you can always fix things if you keep trying." David froze, his gaze fixed on the boy. The words struck deeper than Ethan could have known. "You're right," he said quietly. "Mistakes don't have to be permanent." Inside the house, David found Grace wiping down the counter. She glanced at him, immediately sensing something was off. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. David hesitated, then decided to confide in her. "I got a text from my daughter, Marianne. We haven't spoken in years." Grace put down the cloth and turned to face him fully. "That's a big deal, David. What did she say?" "She heard about what I'm doing here. She wants to talk." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "But I don't even know where to start. There's so much to fix and I'm not sure she'll even listen." Grace's expression softened. The fact that she reached out means she's willing to listen. That's a start. David nodded but remained unconvinced. Grace stepped closer, her voice steady and encouraging. "Second chances are rare, David. Don't waste this one. Just be honest with her." That evening, David returned to the cabin. The quiet solitude pressed down on him as he sat at the table, staring at his phone again. Ethan's words echoed in his mind. "You can always fix things if you keep trying." With trembling hands, David typed out a reply. "I'd love to talk. When would be a good time?" He stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the send button. Then, with a deep breath, he tapped it. The message flew off into the ether, leaving him with nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat. Minutes felt like hours as he waited, the silence of the cabin amplifying his anxiety. Then, the phone buzzed. He snatched it up, his pulse quickening. "Tomorrow afternoon. Don't flake, Dad." The bluntness of her reply stung, but David also felt a surge of relief. She had responded. She was willing to talk. It was more than he deserved, but it was a chance to make things right. The next morning, David stopped by the Walker house to check on the progress. Grace was on the porch, sipping coffee as the early sunlight bathed the yard. "I've got something tomorrow," David said hesitantly. "A conversation I've been avoiding for a long time." Grace set her mug down, her eyes searching his. "Marianne?" He nodded. "She agreed to talk, but I don't know if I'll say the right things. I don't want to mess this up." Grace smiled faintly, her voice steady. "If she's reaching out, it means she hasn't given up on you yet. Just show her the man I've seen here, the man who's willing to work, to try, to care. That's enough." David swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. He managed a small nod, then turned to leave. As he walked away, her words lingered in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. As he drove back to the cabin, his phone buzzed with another message. This time it was Ethan. "Don't forget about the garden, we'll need your help." David chuckled softly, the boy's optimism lifting his spirits. Tomorrow would be difficult, but for now he let himself savor the small victories. A repaired roof, a budding friendship, and the chance to rebuild a bridge he thought had long since burned. The small cafe on the outskirts of town had a quiet charm, with soft lighting and the low hum of conversation filling the air. David McAllister stood outside, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt for the third time, though it had already been perfectly tailored. His eyes scanned the parking lot as if each passing car might bring Marianne. His heart raced, not with the confidence he once carried in boardrooms, but with a vulnerability he hadn't felt in years. When he finally stepped inside, the warm scent of coffee and pastries did little to soothe his nerves. He chose a table near the window, offering a clear view of the entrance. The minutes dragged, each second making him question his decision to reply to her text. Was this the right time? Did she even truly want to see him? The cafe door jingled, pulling David from his thoughts. Marianne walked in, her posture erect and her expression unreadable. She was wearing a crisp blazer over a simple blouse, her sharp features softened only slightly by the delicate curls framing her face. She paused for a moment, her eyes locking with David's before she approached. "Hi, Dad," she said simply, her tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of something David couldn't quite place. Hesitation, perhaps, or curiosity. "Hi, Marianne," he replied, standing awkwardly before motioning to the seat across from him. They sat, the silence between them as heavy as the years they'd spent apart. David tried to offer a polite smile, but Marianne's guarded demeanor made it clear that this wouldn't be an easy reunion. David cleared his throat, searching for a way to break the ice. I saw your last book on the bestseller list. Congratulations. It must feel incredible to see your work resonate with so many people." Marianne's lips tightened into a thin line. "Thanks," she said, her tone clipped. She stirred her coffee slowly, as though buying time to decide how much of herself she was willing to share. David felt the distance between them like a chasm. "I've always known you were talented," he added, hoping to bridge the gap. Marianne set her spoon down, meeting his gaze for the first time since she arrived. "Dad, we both know this isn't about my book." The directness of her words startled him, but he nodded. "You're right. It's not. He paused, the weight of his guilt catching in his throat. "I don't even know where to start." "How about with why?" Marianne leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. "Why did you put your career ahead of everything else? Why wasn't I enough?" The questions struck like blows, each one carrying the weight of years of hurt and abandonment. David lowered his eyes, unable to meet her steady gaze. "I thought I was doing what was best," he began. "I thought if I could provide for you, give you the life I didn't have, that it would be enough. But it wasn't." Her voice wavered, but she held firm. "I didn't need more things, Dad. I needed you. And every time you chose a meeting, a deal, or a client over me, it felt like I wasn't worth your time." David's chest tightened, the full impact of her words sinking in. "You're right," he said softly. "I failed you. I was so blinded by my own ambitions that I didn't see what I was losing. And by the time I realized it, I thought it was too late to fix things." Marianne's expression softened slightly, though the pain in her eyes remained. "It's not that I didn't understand why you worked so hard," she admitted, "but you never stopped. You never looked back to see what you were missing." "I see it now," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I've had a lot of time to reflect, especially over these past few weeks. Helping the Walkers, meeting Ethan. It's made me realize how much I took for granted, how much I let slip away. I don't expect you to forgive me, Marianne, but I need you to know how sorry I am." The tension at the table began to ease, replaced by a fragile sense of understanding. Marianne took a slow sip of her coffee before setting the cup down with a faint clink. "I reached out because I saw what you were doing for that family," she said. "It didn't sound like the dad I knew, the one who always put himself first." David nodded, his hands clasped tightly together. "I've changed, Marianne. I know I've said that before, but this time I'm not just saying it. I want to show you. I want to prove that I can be the father you deserve." Marianne studied him, her guarded expression giving way to something softer. "I want to believe you," she said finally, "but I can't just forget everything that happened." "I'm not asking you to forget," David said earnestly. "I'm asking for a chance to make things right." For a long moment, neither spoke. The quiet hum of the cafe filled the space between them, a backdrop to the unspoken emotions that hung in the air. Finally, Marianne exhaled, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I'll give you a chance, Dad, but don't waste it." As they walked out of the cafe, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Marianne paused by her car, turning to look at David one last time. "You know, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're trying." "Thank you," David replied, his voice steady but his heart racing. "I won't let you down." Marianne gave a small nod before getting into her car and driving away. David watched until her car disappeared down the road, the weight of her parting words settling heavily on his shoulders. As he turned toward his own car, a quiet determination flickered in his eyes. "I won't waste this," he whispered to himself, the promise echoing in his mind as he drove back toward the Walker home. Later that afternoon, Helen Jenkins appeared once more, her demeanor less guarded than before. She carried a clipboard, her sharp eyes softened by a hint of curiosity. "I've been talking to some folks," she began, handing the clipboard to David. "There's a local business group that's interested in funding community projects. You've been making waves around here, McAllister. Thought you might want to look into it." David accepted the clipboard, genuinely surprised. "Thank you, Helen, that means a lot." Helen crossed her arms, glancing at the garden sign with a faint smile. "Don't make me regret it." Her gesture was small, but it felt like a breakthrough. David watched her walk away, the clipboard in his hand serving as a symbol of something larger than himself, an opportunity to leave a meaningful legacy. That evening, David sat in his cabin, the clipboard resting on his desk alongside his phone. He stared at Ryan's number, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his chest. Memories of his past life surfaced, the long hours, the hollow victories, the strained relationships. Then he thought of Ethan, Grace, and Marianne. Reaching for his phone, David dialed Ryan's number. The conversation was brief but decisive. "I can't take the deal, Ryan," David said firmly. "I'm staying here. There's something more important I need to focus on." Ryan was stunned, but David didn't waver. When the call ended, he felt an unexpected lightness, as though a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. Just as he was settling into bed, David's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Marianne. His breath caught as he opened the message. Attached was an old photo of the two of them at the beach, David holding a much younger Marianne on his shoulders, both of them laughing. Beneath the photo was a simple message. "Remember this? Let's create more moments like these." David stared at the screen, his heart swelling with a mixture of joy and trepidation. Marianne's words were an invitation, but they also carried a challenge. Could he truly rise to the occasion? As he set the phone down, David whispered to himself, "I won't let her down." The rhythmic sound of hammers echoed through the Walkers' backyard, blending with the laughter of neighbors and the rustling of the newly planted flowers in the garden. The swing Ethan had envisioned now hung proudly from the porch, its ropes tied securely to sturdy beams. For the first time in a long while, the backyard felt alive, full of hope, joy, and the promise of something better. David stood by the edge of the garden, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the scene. A deep sense of satisfaction settled over him. This wasn't just a project anymore, it was a transformation, not only of the Walker's home, but of his own life as well. "Hey, McAllister," Helen Jenkins called out, carrying a tray of lemonade toward the gathering of neighbors. "Don't think you can slack off now. There's still that patch of weeds by the fence." David laughed, a sound that had become increasingly natural in recent days. "Yes, ma'am," he replied with mock seriousness, grabbing a pair of gloves. He noticed the corners of Helen's mouth twitch upward, a far cry from the skepticism she had shown just weeks ago. The project had taken on a life of its own. Neighbors filtered in and out throughout the day, bringing tools, flowers, and even baked goods to keep the group energized. Tommy Carter directed some of the work near the porch, while a few children from the neighborhood darted around the garden, giggling as they helped plant small seedlings. Grace stood near the kitchen window watching the flurry of activity. Her gaze lingered on David, who was crouched beside Ethan, helping him carefully secure the wooden hope sign in the center of the garden. The sight brought a lump to her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had come to rely on David's presence, how much she trusted him. Ethan wiped his forehead dramatically and grinned. "There, perfect," he announced, stepping back to admire the sign. "What do you think, Mom?" Grace stepped out onto the porch, her voice warm. "It's beautiful, Ethan. You did an amazing job." David glanced up at her, his smile softening. "He's got a great eye for this." Grace nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We're lucky to have you both," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Later in the afternoon, as the bustle of the project wound down, David found a moment of quiet by the porch steps. He pulled out his phone, staring at the screen where Marianne's name was displayed. Her call had come earlier than expected, her tone more curious than accusatory. "So why them?" she had asked, her voice measured but not cold. David had taken a deep breath before answering. "Because they remind me of what I lost, Marianne, of what I want to be again. Helping them is helping me too. It's hard to explain, but it feels right." There had been a pause on the other end, followed by a surprising response. "Maybe I should see this for myself," she had said, and now she was on her way. By late afternoon, the backyard was nearly complete. The garden brimmed with colorful flowers, the freshly painted porch gleamed in the sunlight, and the swing swayed gently in the breeze. Ethan's excitement was infectious as he bounded from one project to the next, showing off the progress to anyone who would listen. Grace joined David on the porch swing, her voice soft but steady. "You've done so much for us," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But it's more than just the repairs. You've given Ethan hope, and me too." David looked at her, the sincerity in her words cutting through his usual defenses. "I think you've given me more than I've given you," he admitted. "Being here, it's changed everything for me." Grace's eyes met his, a quiet understanding passing between them. Before either could say more, the sound of a car approaching drew their attention. David's heart skipped a beat. The sleek sedan came to a stop in front of the house, and Marianne stepped out, her expression a mix of curiosity and cautious anticipation. She scanned the yard, her gaze landing first on the garden, then on Ethan and Grace, and finally on David. Ethan, ever the welcoming spirit, ran up to her, his hand extended in greeting. "Hi, I'm Ethan." Marianne's lips curved into a tentative smile as she shook his hand. "Hi, Ethan. I'm Marianne." David watched the exchange from the porch, his breath catching as he realized how much this moment meant. He stood, taking a few hesitant steps forward. "Marianne," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "This is more than I expected," she said, gesturing to the garden and the group of neighbors still lingering nearby. "You've been busy." David nodded, his heart pounding. "I couldn't have done it without them. Or without you." Marianne's gaze softened, and for the first time, David saw a glimmer of acceptance in her eyes. The group slowly gathered around, curious but respectful of the moment unfolding. Helen handed Marianne a glass of lemonade, her usual sharpness replaced with warmth. "You've got quite the dad here," she said, surprising even herself. Marianne chuckled softly, her expression thoughtful. "We'll see." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the yard, David felt a profound sense of gratitude. The seeds of hope, both literal and metaphorical, had been planted, and for the first time in years he believed they would grow. The late afternoon sun bathed the walkers' backyard in a golden glow, casting long shadows across the freshly planted garden. The hope sign stood proudly at the center, a testament to resilience and new beginnings. Marianne lingered at the edge of the gathering, her arms crossed as she observed the lively scene. Neighbors mingled, their laughter blending with the occasional clink of tools being packed away. Ethan darted through the crowd, proudly showing off the swing and garden he had envisioned. Meanwhile, David paced nervously near the garden, stealing glances at Marianne, trying to summon the courage to approach her. "Dad?" Marianne's voice cut through his thoughts, laced with equal parts curiosity and hesitation. David turned sharply, his smile faltering before it widened earnestly. "Marianne, I'm so glad you came." She nodded, her gaze scanning the scene. "You've been busy," she remarked, her tone neutral but her eyes betraying her curiosity. "This doesn't exactly scream the dad I knew." David chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I suppose it doesn't. But I'd like to think it's the dad I'm trying to become." He gestured toward Grace and Ethan, who were chatting near the porch. "Come on, I'd like you to meet them." As they approached, Ethan was the first to notice. His face lit up, and he bounded over, his enthusiasm infectious. "Hi, you must be Marianne. I'm Ethan," he said, extending his hand. Marianne smiled despite herself, shaking his hand. "Hi, Ethan. Nice to meet you." "This is my mom, Grace," Ethan continued, gesturing to Grace, who offered Marianne a warm, welcoming smile. "Marianne," Grace said gently, shaking her hand. "It's lovely to meet you. David's told us a lot about you." Marianne's brows lifted slightly, surprised but not unkind. "Has he now?" "Only the good things," David interjected quickly, earning a small laugh from Grace and a faint, tentative smile from Marianne. As the introductions wrapped up, Ethan tugged on Marianne's sleeve. "Come on, I have to show you the garden. David helped me make it. Well, he wasn't great with the tools at first, but he got better." Marianne glanced at David, her curiosity piqued. "Sure, lead the way." Ethan led Marianne through the garden, his excitement palpable as he explained every detail. The flowers, the garden bed design, and the swing on the porch. Marianne crouched beside the hope sign, running her fingers along its edge. "Ethan said the garden's about new beginnings," David said softly, standing behind her. "He's taught me a lot about those." Marianne didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the sign. Finally, she stood, brushing off her hands. "It's beautiful," she admitted, her voice softer now. "He's a bright kid." David nodded, his chest tightening with pride. "He is, and he's been more of a mentor to me than I have to him." Marianne glanced at him, her guarded expression wavering. "Maybe you're not as hopeless as I thought." Grace appeared moments later carrying a tray of glasses filled with iced tea. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "You're staying, right, Marianne?" Marianne hesitated, glancing at David before nodding. "Sure, why not?" Grace beamed, setting the tray down on the makeshift table set up in the backyard. Neighbors began to gather around, bringing plates of food and chairs. The atmosphere was warm and lively, the kind of scene that felt worlds away from the cold, distant life Marianne associated with her father. As the meal began, stories and laughter filled the air, Neighbors shared anecdotes about David's efforts, some humorous, others heartfelt. Tommy Carter recounted David's initial attempts at hammering nails, eliciting laughter from the group. "It's true," David admitted, grinning. "I might have bent more nails than I drove in straight." Marianne watched the interaction with quiet interest. This was a side of her father she'd never seen before, a man who wasn't just commanding respect but earning it through humility and effort. After dinner, as the gathering began to wind down, David and Marianne stepped aside, finding a quiet spot near the porch swing. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink. "I know this must feel strange," David began, his tone earnest, "seeing me like this. It's strange for me too." Marianne crossed her arms, leaning against the porch railing. "Strange doesn't begin to cover it," she admitted. "But I can't ignore what I've seen tonight. This," she gestured to the backyard, "it's not what I expected." David took a deep breath. "I don't blame you for being skeptical. I've spent so much of my life chasing things that didn't matter. But this, helping the walkers, reconnecting with you, it's shown me what does matter." Marianne studied him, her expression unreadable. "I want to believe you, Dad, but I've heard promises before." David nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, and I'm not asking you to believe my woe." David ended the call without making a decision. Restless, he drove to the walker's home, seeking clarity in the familiar rhythm of the work he'd come to cherish. Grace greeted him at the door, immediately noticing his furrowed brow. "Something on your mind?" she asked gently. David hesitated before telling her about Ryan's call. He expected judgment or disbelief, but Grace only nodded thoughtfully. "David, you've come a long way," she said, "but this is a moment where you have to decide what truly matters. Words are easy, but actions, they're what people remember, especially the people who are learning to trust you." Her words stayed with him as he joined Ethan in the backyard. The boy was kneeling in the dirt, carefully arranging a patch of flowers. When he noticed David, his face lit up. "Mr. McAllister, look, I'm planting a spot just for Mom. These are her favorite flowers." He beamed with pride. "She doesn't know yet, it's a surprise." David crouched beside him, watching the boy's delicate hands as he worked. "That's a thoughtful thing to do, Ethan. She'll love it." Ethan looked up, his eyes bright. "It's because of you. You taught me how to dream bigger." He paused, frowning slightly. "But you don't look happy today. Are you okay?" David forced a smile. "Just thinking about some decisions I have to make." Ethan's expression grew serious. "Well, when I mess up my sketches, I don't throw them away. I just keep drawing until they look right." David laughed softly, ruffling Ethan's hair. "You're wiser than most adults, you know that?" Ethan grinned, returning to his flowers. Later that afternoon, David sat on the garden bench, his phone clutched in his hand. Ryan's words echoed in his mind, a constant tug back toward the life he'd left behind. But Grace's insight, Ethan's innocence, and Marianne's fragile trust weighed heavier. He opened his messages and saw one from Marianne. "Thanks for dinner last night. I could see the difference in you. I hope it's real." David's chest tightened. He had made promises, not just to the walkers, but to himself, to Marianne, and to this new path he'd chosen. Taking a deep breath, he dialed Ryan. "David," Ryan answered, his tone sharp with anticipation. "I can't do it," David said firmly. "I'm not coming back. My priorities have changed." There was a long silence before Ryan exploded. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? This is career suicide." David listened, calm and resolute. "I know what I'm doing, Ryan, and it's the right choice for me." Ryan cursed under his breath before the line went dead. David exhaled, a mix of relief and sadness coursing through him. He had closed a chapter of his life that once defined him. Now he was free to fully embrace the man he was becoming. That evening, as David sat on the porch, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from Marianne. "Hey Dad, I've been thinking. I want to try something. Let's meet again, just you and me. Call me when you're ready." David replayed the message twice, a smile spreading across his face. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time he felt like he was heading in the right direction. David McAllister entered the quaint cafe, its cozy interior bathed in soft morning light filtering through large windows. The smell of fresh pastries and brewing coffee filled the air, but David barely noticed. His hands gripped the strap of his leather bag, his nerves on edge. He arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table away from the bustle of the counter. Unpacking a small notepad, he jotted down a few points he wanted to remember. This wasn't just another meeting. This was a chance to rewrite years of regret and missed opportunities. He had replayed the scenario in his mind all night, but now, sitting in the cafe, the weight of reality pressed down on him. The soft chime of the entrance bell broke his thoughts. Marianne stepped inside, scanning the room until her eyes landed on him. She wore a light cardigan over a simple dress, her posture poised yet reserved. David stood quickly, offering a tentative smile. "Hi," she said, her voice neutral but not unkind. "Hi," David replied, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Thanks for coming." Marianne nodded, sliding into the chair. The first few moments passed in silence, the clinking of cups and murmured conversations around them filling the space. David cleared his throat. "I'm really grateful you agreed to meet me again. I know this isn't easy." Marianne met his gaze, her expression guarded. "It's not, but I want to understand. What made you change?" He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Honestly, it was realizing how far I'd drifted from what really matters. Helping the walkers. It's like they held up a mirror. I saw someone I didn't want to be anymore." Marianne tilted her head, her skepticism evident. "Why now? Why them?" David leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "It started as a way to repay Ethan for his kindness. But the more I worked with them, the more I realized how empty my life had become. Success, wealth, they were all I cared about. And in chasing those things, I lost you." Marianne's expression softened, though her voice remained steady. "You didn't just lose me, Dad. You gave me away." The words hit David like a punch. He swallowed hard, his voice quiet but steady. "I know I did, and I'm not here to excuse it. I just want to make it right, if you'll let me." Marianne leaned back, folding her arms. "You know, I used to draw pictures of you when I was little. You were always the hero in my stories. Then one day I stopped. You weren't around to be the hero anymore." David flinched but nodded. "I don't deserve to be anyone's hero, least of all yours. But I can try to be someone you'd want in your life again." She reached into her bag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "I found this recently." She handed it to him. David unfolded it carefully, his breath catching. It was a drawing from years ago, a child's crayon rendering of a man and a little girl standing on a beach. Above them, in wobbly letters, were the words, "Daddy's little girl." David's voice broke as he spoke. "I remember that day. It was one of the few weekends I didn't work. You were so happy." Marianne's eyes glistened, but her tone remained firm. "You can't just erase the years you missed, Dad. It doesn't work like that." "I know," he said softly, "but I can spend the rest of my life trying to make up for them. Not with grand gestures or promises, but by being here. Really being here." The cafe seemed quieter as they sat in the moment, the weight of their shared history settling between them. Finally, Marianne sighed. "You've changed. I can see that. But it's going to take time to rebuild this. Trust isn't something you can buy." David nodded. "I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness, just a chance." Marianne studied him for a long moment before a faint smile touched her lips. "It's a start, Dad. Let's see where it goes." Relief washed over David like a wave, and for the first time in years, he felt like he had taken a real step toward healing. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As they left the cafe, David suggested a walk through the nearby park. The sun was higher now, casting dappled light through the trees. They strolled in companionable silence, the distance between them feeling less insurmountable. "I'd like to visit the garden again," Marianne said suddenly. "Maybe even help out." David's heart lifted. "I think Ethan would love that. He's been working on a surprise for his mom. It's a beautiful space now." Marianne smiled. "It sounds like it. I'd like to see what you've built." David glanced at her, gratitude shining in his eyes. I'd like that too. The Walkers' backyard was alive with the vibrant colors of Ethan's thriving garden. Sunlight poured through the branches of the oak trees, casting dappled shadows over the blooming flowers and freshly turned soil. David McAllister stood at the garden gate, waiting, his heart racing as Marianne's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, her movements measured, a blend of curiosity and hesitation evident in her posture. David waved, trying to mask his nerves with a welcoming smile. Marianne gave a slight nod in return before glancing around, taking in the scene that had become such an integral part of her father's new life. Grace Walker appeared from the porch, her warm demeanor immediately easing some of the tension. You must be Marianne, Grace said, extending a hand. I'm Grace. It's so nice to finally meet you. Marianne shook her hand, offering a polite smile. Thank you. It's nice to meet you too. Before Marianne could say more, Ethan came bounding up, his excitement barely contained. Hi, you're David's daughter, right? Come on, I have to show you something. Marianne blinked at the boy's enthusiasm, but followed as Ethan led her toward the heart of the garden. David trailed behind, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude for the boy's infectious energy. Ethan stopped in front of the small wooden sign he had carved weeks ago. The word hope was etched deeply into the wood, the letters now surrounded by budding flowers in soft hues of pink and yellow. This is the centerpiece, Ethan explained proudly. It's what the whole garden is about. Marianne crouched down to get a closer look. You made this? She asked, her tone softening. Ethan nodded. David helped me. It's about starting fresh and believing things can get better even if they're really hard. Marianne glanced at David, her expression unreadable. It's beautiful, she said quietly, standing back up. David cleared his throat. Ethan's put a lot of heart into this place. It's become more than a garden. It's a symbol of everything we've been working toward. Marianne nodded but said nothing, her gaze lingering on the sign for a moment longer before turning back to the rest of the yard. Grace appeared with a tray of lemonade, breaking the silence. Ethan's been talking about this visit for days, she said, handing Marianne a glass. He wanted everything to be perfect. It's already wonderful, Marianne replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. David seized the opportunity to suggest they plant something together. Ethan's been wanting to add more flowers along the fence line. How about we help him? Marianne hesitated for a moment before nodding. Sure, why not? They worked side by side, digging small holes and placing bright marigold blooms into the earth. The activity eased some of the tension between them, and Marianne began to relax, even laughing when Ethan teased David for being too slow with the trowel. Gardening suits you, Dad, Marianne said with a hint of a smile, her voice teasing but affectionate. David chuckled. It's a new skill, but I'm getting the hang of it. The lighthearted moment felt like a breakthrough, and David silently thanked Ethan for bridging the gap between him and his daughter. As the afternoon waned, Grace invited Marianne to sit on the porch while David and Ethan tidied up the garden tools. You know, Grace began, her tone conversational yet deliberate. When David first showed up, I wasn't sure what to think of him, but he surprised us all. Marianne turned to her, intrigued. How so? Grace smiled, her gaze thoughtful. He's been consistent. He didn't just show up and make promises, he followed through. And not just for us. He's built something here, not just with the garden, but with the community. Marianne listened intently, her skepticism gradually giving way to curiosity. It's hard to reconcile this version of him with the man I grew up with, she admitted. Grace nodded. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it's real. You being here means more to him than you probably realize. Marianne's gaze drifted to the garden where David was helping Ethan stack empty pots. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that Grace might be right. As the day wound down, Ethan approached Marianne with something in his hand. I made this for you, he said, holding out a simple beaded bracelet. So you don't forget today. Marianne took the bracelet, her eyes misting as she slid it onto her wrist. Thank you, Ethan. I'll treasure it. She pulled the boy into a hug, her emotions catching her off guard. Glancing at David, she offered a small, tentative smile. He's pretty special, isn't he? David nodded. He is, and so are you, Marianne's expression softened further, and for the first time, David felt the wall between them beginning to crumble. As she prepared to leave, Marianne paused at the garden gate, turning back to David. "Seeing you here with them, it's made me hopeful. For us." David swallowed the lump in his throat, his voice steady but emotional. "I'll keep proving it to you, Marianne, one day at a time." She nodded, her smile small but genuine. "That's all I ask." As she drove away, David stood at the gate, his heart full but heavy with the knowledge that their journey was far from over. Grace approached quietly, her expression thoughtful. "So," she said softly, "what's next for you, David? Because something tells me this isn't the end of your journey." David looked out at the blooming garden, the hope sign standing tall. A thoughtful smile spread across his face. "No, Grace, it's just the beginning." David McAllister stood in the quiet of his cabin, sunlight spilling across the wooden floor as he sipped his morning coffee. The chirping of birds outside blended with the distant hum of life from the Walker neighborhood. On the table before him lay a handwritten agenda for the community meeting later that morning. His phone buzzed, breaking the peaceful moment. A text from Marianne lit up the screen. "Let's have dinner soon. Just us." A wave of warmth swept through David as he read the message, her words carrying the weight of cautious trust. He typed back quickly, "I'd love that. Just say when." As he set the phone down, he glanced at the garden blueprint Ethan had given him the day before. The boy's vision had sparked something in him, a desire not just to repair what had been broken, but to build something entirely new. The community meeting was held in the small town hall, a modest building with faded paint and wooden benches. Neighbors filed in, their chatter filling the room as David took a seat near the front. Helen Jenkins waved to him from across the room, her once skeptical demeanor now softened into genuine friendliness. Tommy Carter, the meeting's moderator, called the group to order. "Today," he began, "we've invited someone who's become a part of this community in ways I think we all admire. David McAllister has been working with the Walkers, and I think we can all learn something from his experience." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd as David stood, nerves prickling at his edges. He cleared his throat, glancing around the room. "When I first came here," he began, "I didn't know much about this community, or about myself, if I'm being honest." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What I've learned from the Walkers, from all of you, is that connection and kindness matter more than any business deal or bank account ever could. Ethan taught me what it means to believe in hope, and Grace showed me the power of trust, even when it's hard. These lessons have changed me." David spoke of the repairs to the Walkers' home, the garden project, and the profound sense of fulfillment he'd found in building something meaningful. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment before applause broke out, the sound echoing off the walls. After the meeting, Grace found David outside, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She handed it to him and gestured toward a nearby bench. "You handled that well," she said with a smile. David chuckled, taking a sip of the tea. "I wasn't sure I could find the right words." "You did," Grace assured him. Her gaze turned thoughtful as she continued. "Have you thought about what's next?" David frowned slightly. "Next? You've done so much for us," Grace said, "but there are other families in this town who could use someone like you, someone who knows how to make things happen." David hesitated, the idea both exciting and daunting. "It's crossed my mind," he admitted, "but I'm not sure where to start." Grace smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the first step is just listening to the people around you." That evening, Marianne called as David sat in his cabin, Ethan's blueprint spread across the table. "Hey, Dad," her voice came through, lighter than he'd expected. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day about giving back." David smiled. "What about it?" "I'm starting a volunteer initiative at school to help underprivileged students," Marianne explained, her excitement evident. "I thought maybe you could come speak to the group, share your story." David's chest tightened with pride. "I'd be honored," he said. "When's the first meeting?" "Next month," Marianne replied. "I'll send you the details. It's small, but I think it could grow into something big." David's mind raced with possibilities. "You're going to make a real difference, Marianne." "So are you, Dad," she said softly before hanging up. The next day, Ethan bounded into the cabin, his face alight with excitement. "I finished it," he exclaimed, holding up a revised version of his blueprint. David took the paper, his eyes scanning the intricate details of the proposed community center. "This is incredible, Ethan," he said, genuinely impressed. "It's for families like ours," Ethan explained. "A place where people can get help fixing their houses or just somewhere safe to be." David felt a lump form in his throat. "You've got a big heart, kid." Ethan grinned. "I learned from you." David resolved then and there to make the blueprint a reality. He began calling contacts from his corporate days, leveraging old connections to gather funding and support. To his surprise, many were eager to contribute, inspired by his story of transformation. As twilight descended, David stood in the Walker's garden, Ethan's blueprint in one hand and his phone in the other. He called Marianne, her voice answering on the second ring. "I think you've found your path, Dad," she said after hearing his plans. "Let's make it happen." David gazed at the garden's hope sign, its letters glowing softly in the fading light. "This is just the beginning," he whispered, a smile spreading across his face. David sat in his living room, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating Ethan's carefully drawn blueprint spread out before him. The intricate details, a vibrant garden at the center, flanked by classrooms and open spaces, spoke of hope, community, and renewal. For a moment, he simply stared, a mix of excitement and trepidation coursing through him. This wasn't just a project, it was the next step in a life he was still learning to navigate. The phone sat heavy in his hand as he dialed a familiar number. "Alan, it's David," he said when the line connected. "I've got something I think you'll want to hear about." His voice carried the confidence he once wielded effortlessly in boardrooms, though this time it came from a deeper place. Some calls were encouraging, old colleagues intrigued by his vision for the community center. Others were less so, their skepticism clear. "A garden and classrooms? Sounds noble, but is it feasible, David?" one voice asked. He hung up after the last call, a flicker of doubt threatening to dim his resolve. But the blueprint on the table seemed to beckon him forward. The first planning meeting brought a sense of purpose that was palpable. Grace, Ethan, and Marianne joined him in the Walkers' cozy living room, the coffee table crowded with notebooks, markers, and Grace's famous cookies. Ethan kicked off the session with boundless enthusiasm, describing how the garden could be a place of healing and growth. His optimism was contagious, drawing smiles from everyone. Marianne's focus was practical. "We should offer educational programs," she suggested. "Reading sessions for kids, job workshops for adults, something that creates lasting impact." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "It also needs to feel like home for anyone who walks through the doors, a safe space where people can connect and rebuild." David listened, scribbling notes, the pieces of their collective vision starting to take shape. As the meeting wrapped up, they agreed on next steps: a site visit, community outreach, and securing more funding. The chosen site was a vacant lot on the edge of town, overgrown with weeds but brimming with potential. As they walked the perimeter, Ethan's excitement was palpable, while Marianne snapped photos for their proposal. But their enthusiasm was soon tempered by a visit from a local official. "You'll need permits, inspections, and guarantees for funding," the man said, his tone skeptical. "Projects like this often fizzle out. Are you sure you're ready for this, Mr. McAllister?" David's confidence wavered. The official's doubts mirrored the whispers of his own insecurities. That night, he found himself sitting in the garden Ethan had designed, seeking solace in its quiet beauty. Marianne joined him, a mug of tea in her hands. "I know that look," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. David glanced at her. "What look?" "The one that says you're about to give up," she replied with a faint smile. Her tone softened. "There was a time I almost dropped out of college. I didn't think I was good enough. But then a professor told me he believed in me, and that was enough to push me forward." Her words struck a chord, igniting a spark of determination. "One person's belief," he murmured, looking back at the garden. "It really can make a difference." Marianne nodded. "It did for me, and it's what you're doing for Ethan, for Grace, for all of us." The following day, Grace arranged for David to speak at a local community event. The gathering was modest but full of eager faces, from elderly neighbors to young families. Standing at the podium, David felt a surge of nerves. But then he spotted Ethan and Grace in the crowd, their presence grounding him. "When I came here," he began, "I was lost, caught up in a world that valued profits over people. But meeting Ethan and Grace changed everything. They reminded me that success isn't about what you build for yourself, it's about what you build for others." His speech resonated, drawing a standing ovation. As the applause faded, Ethan took the microphone. "The community center isn't just an idea," he said, his youthful voice carrying across the room. "It's a promise that no one gets left behind." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy palpable. Volunteers stepped forward, offering their time and resources. Small donations began to trickle in, each one a testament to the power of shared hope. That evening, as the team celebrated their progress, David's phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Let's talk." It was from Alan, one of his former corporate partners, someone whose influence could make or break their project. David's heart raced as he read the message, a mix of excitement and apprehension building within him. He turned to Grace, who was packing up dishes. "I just got a message from an old colleague," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "This could be big, or it could set us back." Grace looked at him, her expression calm but resolute. "Whatever happens, you've already made a difference, David. Don't lose sight of that." David nodded, her words a reminder of how far he'd come. He glanced back at Ethan's blueprint, its bold lines and vibrant ideas a testament to the future they were building together. David sat at his desk, the soft hum of the morning's quiet broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. His eyes lingered on the email from Thomas Greer, the bold subject line, "Let's meet," glowing ominously on his screen. The name carried weight, a reminder of his former life. A man who had been both a rival and an ally in the world of high-stakes finance. The email was succinct, offering a meeting to discuss the community center project, yet David knew it would be far from simple. He exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the decision ahead. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a test of his resolve, an opportunity to merge the man he used to be with the man he was becoming. The following morning, David and Marianne traveled to the city. The sleek, glass-walled office where Thomas Greer awaited was a sharp contrast to the warm, earthy simplicity of the Walkers' home. As they stepped into the room, David felt a pang of unease, the sterile atmosphere a stark reminder of the life he had left behind. "David," Thomas greeted with a firm handshake, his tone cordial but his sharp eyes betraying a hint of skepticism. "I have to admit I was surprised to hear about your philanthropic pursuits." David smiled, his confidence growing as he began to speak about the community center. He described the vision, the inspiration drawn from Ethan's hope and Grace's resilience, and the potential to transform lives. But as he finished, Thomas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "It's ambitious," Thomas said, "but what's your plan for sustainability? Projects like these can crumble without long-term funding or measurable impact." Before David could respond, Marianne stepped in. Her voice was steady, her conviction clear. She spoke of Ethan, of the garden that had become a beacon of hope, and of the countless children who could benefit from a space dedicated to growth and connection. Her passion filled the room, her words a bridge between skepticism and possibility. Thomas nodded, visibly impressed. "You've got a strong case. I'll fund the initial phase, but only if you meet specific benchmarks. Permits, community backing, operational plans. No cutting corners." David extended his hand. "We'll deliver." Back in the Walkers' neighborhood, the pressure to meet Thomas's conditions mounted. The team worked tirelessly, but setbacks loomed. A critical permit application was denied due to bureaucratic red tape, and rumors began to swirl about the center's purpose, fueling local opposition. Tensions flared during a late-night planning session at the Walkers' home. "What if we can't pull this off?" David asked, frustration creeping into his voice. Marianne, equally frustrated, leaned forward. "Then we show them why it matters." Her solution came in the form of a day of service event, a chance to showcase the center's potential impact. The team threw themselves into planning, transforming the garden into a hub of activity. Marianne organized workshops for children, while David prepared to address parents and local leaders. The event was a resounding success. Neighbors gathered, their initial skepticism melting away as they saw the tangible benefits. Marianne's energy was contagious, her ability to connect with people turning doubters into supporters. David's speech struck a chord, his sincerity evident as he shared his journey and the lessons he had learned. "Hope isn't just a word," David said, his voice strong. "It's a choice to build, to believe, and to create a future where no one is left behind." Ethan's contribution was the final touch. With a projector and his carefully crafted visuals, he presented the center's design to the city council representatives in attendance. His youthful enthusiasm and clear vision left the room buzzing with excitement. As the event wound down, Marianne received a surprise visitor, her mother. The tension was palpable as the two exchanged a cautious hug, but it was clear the day's success had softened her stance. "I can see the change in your father," she said quietly. "Maybe this time he'll follow through." Marianne nodded, her expression thoughtful. The exchange was brief but meaningful, a step toward healing the fractures of their shared past. That evening, as the team celebrated in the Walker's garden, David's phone buzzed with a notification. The subject line of the email read, "Decision on permit, City Council requesting meeting." He turned the screen toward Marianne and Grace, a mixture of hope and anxiety in his eyes. "It's happening," he said. "Tomorrow morning." Marianne placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We've done the work. Now it's up to them." David looked at the glowing hope sign in the garden, its light reflecting the collective effort of everyone who had believed in the project. He nodded, determination burning in his chest. As we close this heartfelt journey, David's transformation reminds us of a powerful truth. No matter where we come from or how far we stray, it's never too late to choose kindness, to repair broken relationships, and to find purpose in serving others. His story teaches us that acts of generosity, no matter how small, can create ripples of change, not just in our lives but in the lives of those around us. What stood out most to you in this story? Was it David's journey of redemption, Ethan's unwavering hope, or the power of a community coming together? Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance to rewrite their story? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you've been inspired by this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next tale of transformation and human connection. Together, let's explore more stories that celebrate resilience, compassion, and the enduring power of hope. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. 15.